about the news. Daddy leaves it on all day through. I've been thinking about the wars, and to be honest, I can't take it anymore. I hear you every day, the awful words you say, but hate can't be the face of the American dream. I've been thinking about my life and how one day I want to be a mother and a wife. I've been scared of that thought too. In a world of struggle, what are we gonna do? I hear you every day saying it's gonna be okay, but hate can't be the face of the American dream. And I know we've got a long way to go, but I've got to believe that change is a choice and it can start with me. And I've been thinking about our mother and how they took her away from her people, put her in a boarding school, away from her brother, sister, and culture. I can hear her every night saying we've gotta make this right, 'cause hate can't be the face of the American dream. And I know we've got a long way to go, but I've got to believe that change is a choice and it can start with me. And change is a choice and it can start with me. And change is a choice and it can start with you. Let's get on the road now. The snow is coming in and it won't be plowed until morning. Let's drive through the night. If we watch the lines, we'll be alright. Sister's sleeping in the back. She's got a fever, but we can't turn back. We had this dream and it's a sign that we've gotta stop this pipeline. Oh, oh, we know. Oh, oh, we've got to go. Stand for what's right. We're dropping a standing rock tonight. When we arrived, we were greeted by a dove. Took the soil in our hands and prayed for Mother Earth. We stood out there to sing in negative 20 degrees, and we walked the bridge in the march for peace. Oh, oh, we know.
Uju bisandawiag, shkanshkawu Indigenous, Megazi and Dodem, Wanakin and Dabandagos, Kawabigani Gokag and Donjaba, Minishota Makoche in Dayan, Ni Miguechuendam Omaya and Sago. Hello, my relatives. My name is Pearl. I just wanted to welcome you to our event and thank you for being here. I am a program manager with Native Governance Center, and Native Governance Center is a Native-led nonprofit focused on supporting and empowering nations. We are excited for this discussion on building an Indigenized future by engaging our core values. And now more than ever, we've been thinking about how to rebuild with truly Indigenous ways of knowing and doing. Today's event is one of 3 that explores this idea of what it means to build an Indigenized future. And this topic resonates with me personally because I think about the work that I do as a doula and as a mother when centering my life, the way I lead, um, and the decisions I make around a core value such as love. There's so many wonderful things that come with doing that. And I'm very excited for our discussion tonight to, to further explore core values and what that means. And now I'd like to turn it over to our host, Cesar Alvarez.
Thank you so much, Pearl, and good afternoon, good evening to everyone, friends and relatives, fellow rebuilders, others in our listening audience. I want to take this time to briefly introduce myself and just say thank you again for Native Governance Center for holding this conversation this evening on a very important conversation. Dosha, Shkatsha, and Jeed. Hello, friends and relatives. My name is Cesar Alvarez. I am an enrolled member of the 3 affiliated tribes, the home of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara people here on the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation. I just want to thank you all for hosting this conversation tonight, and thank you for affording this opportunity for myself to speak with a very esteemed elder and leader that I greatly look up to and enjoyed speaking with, and always heed his wise words and wisdom and advice that he always gives to us during our rebuilder sessions and just in conversations we've had since. I've been looking forward to this for quite some time, and I'm sure that we will learn so much this evening together. So in this space, it's briefly about myself. I am a cohort 9 member of the Rebuilders program, and I currently work here at the 3 affiliated tribes for my home tribe in intergovernmental affairs. It's been truly challenging times and interesting times we've been living in, and I think these types of conversations are helpful for all of us to kind of get grounded and kind of regain or keep that focus. And so that's what I hope we gain this evening. But I'll turn that over and I'll want to introduce Mr. Regis Pecos, who can introduce himself. We can get started in our conversation. So Regis, good evening.
Good evening, and thank you, Cesar and Pearl. Let me first say how much I appreciate you sharing the spirit of your language, which is one of the most precious gifts of inheritance from all of the generations who've gone before us, that the spirit of such a precious gift continues to survive, and to hear the spirit of the language is soothing to the soul. Kua tsi hopa tseom kuhu e nyan it si ho keishimi mani karstiwana tuna you eat that church 8 shaw new awich go mani ratse sewat you mix shakoya that in the language of the Cochiti people where I was born and blessed to be raised. I just want to give thanks for the prayers offered and answered, that we would have this conversation and share this time together to reflect where we are in our journey together as Indigenous peoples, and to accept and embrace the many challenges we face. So I just wanted to give honor and respect by sharing in my language as I greeted all of you today, this afternoon, and early evening. So with that, Cesar, thank you for the opportunity to share this time with all of you.
Great. So what brings us all together here this evening is to have a conversation around building an indigenized future. And a key part of that, as what we've already covered or started to speak on already, is embracing our core values. And so, Regis, if you could you kind of start this conversation with us about maybe explaining, what does building an indigenized future, what does that mean to you, and how do you interpret what that would mean?
I think foremost, Cesar, is that we have to acknowledge that this is a really prophetic time that our elders foresaw at this stage and at this point in our journey. They prophesied that we would see a time when there would be great sacrifice. But in that great sacrifice and pain and death would be a time to reflect on where we are, to re-examine ourselves. And so first is to acknowledge that all that we have been engaged in with this COVID and this virus was foretold. And so I want to acknowledge that because it is very central and timely to both what Native governance and the center and the program is providing by way of opportunity to all of you, that I want to say thank you for your conscious decision to be part of this process at this stage of your own personal life journeys. And so to help provide for some context, in our Leadership Institute, we use core values as the heart of all of our discourse in responding to the challenges that we face today. So foremost is to acknowledge the gifts of the Creator, our Mother Earth, upon which we step on as we come into this physical world from the spiritual world. It is acknowledging and embracing the gift of language, to embrace language and how it provides us a way to find meaning and purpose in our lives. And of course, embracing that way of life that comes with indigenous laws and customs and an indigenous governance system. And important to bring to life those gifts of the Creator. At the very center of these connected circles is the reference to core values. And if we just simply think for a moment, what core value defines who you are, and what core value defines what you do, and what core value defines why you do what you do, and then to acknowledge who gifted you that. When we acknowledge who gifted us the core value that guides us, that defines who we are and what we do, it is a tremendous opportunity to be reflective that those who gifted us the core value guiding our lives and what we do is someone that had deep love for us. And of course, the next connecting circle to bring all of this central in our lives and what we do, how we relate to people, to comply with the original instructions of how to live and how to be, is very, very much centered in this third connecting circle that I call the circle of our ceremonial cycle, where faith is deeply embedded with regard to a reflection of our core values in the acknowledgement of the gift of our Creator. So in this time, as we're talking about indigenizing ways in which we contribute to the vibrancy and vitality of a shared future, it's important, one, to think about indigenizing our future as really a return to those original instructions and recognizing the gifts of the Creator, the core values that bring them to life, and enriched by our adherence to faith and prayers in that ceremonial cycle.
Wow, that's really a good way to kind of set this conversation, and a good way to kind of, even in this hour while we're together, to really think about, just in while we're here together in this hour, to kind of position ourselves in this space to think about embracing those values and building that indigenized future. So you talk a lot about those core values being important for leadership. Could you explain what you mean by core values? And I think you kind of already started on that point. And for those who might not know what you might mean, and then how have you embraced your core values in your own leadership journey?
You know, again, Cesar, our elders teach us that core values is really the guiding light in our journey through life. And if we see core values as the most, the deepest expression of love of parents who embraced us when we were brought into this world as a spiritual being into this physical world. It's really the family that embraced us, and the gift of community, the many people who nurtured us as we grew up in our respective communities. The reference to core values is really at the very heart of our existence, reflected in those original instructions that Chief Orrin Lyons, who I have been tremendously blessed to have many opportunities to talk at length about our shared ways of life from one end of the country to the other, all given at the time of origin or at the time of creation, or as Pueblo thinks about our emergence as the journey from the spiritual world into this physical world, stepping upon Mother Earth, that is that reference to the gift of our Creator. You know, the whole practice in Pueblo way of life is that when that umbilical cord is cut, it is brought home by the mother to be buried in the fields. And the teaching of the elders goes something like this, that when you practice that value and that custom, the way in which a mother gives life to that child as a spirit, that umbilical cord is what connected them. And in this kind of symbolic gesture that elders teach, when you bury that cord in the fields of the place you call home, it is the way that we are always and will be, by those teachings, connected to Mother Earth, that no matter how far we wander in our lives from our communities, we will always know where home is. And so in this time of emergence, the Creator gifted to us all of what would be necessary to sustain us in this life journey upon Mother Earth. It was land, it was language, it was a way of life, it was the indigenous laws and customs, governance to guide our relationships, that when we wander from our defined core values, that there is a process to bring us back into good standing. And so out of this gift of the Creator is really born the guiding light, as we call it, defined by our core values. And why the question with regard to beginning any conversation is to talk about what is your core value in a way that helps to define and for us to see that this core value is what guides us. It's what guides us to determine what we eventually find ourselves doing to underscore why we do what we do in our lives. And as we talk about core values, as love is one, as respect is another, as compassion is another, as forgiveness is another, integrity to be another. When we answer the question of who gifted you that, in all that we do, our elders teach that when you are guided in your life by core values, you'll never make a wrong decision. So the way that we use core values in our lives, as I shared, prayer is a very integral part of a self-examination daily. Our elders teach us that a way of life is not a practice 1 hour out of the day or 1 day out of the week. It is a conscience, it's a consciousness of the way we live. And prayer is central so that when we wake every day, the teachings of our elders is to offer a prayer to be guided during the course of the day with to ask for guidance in how you interact with people who cross your path in the day, to be guided by all you do in those relations and decisions you make by your core values. And in the evening, our elders also teach is to offer prayer as a self-examination to ask our Creator, how well have we lived this day by our core values? Because in the end of the day, in that reflection, we can also look to honor those who gifted us that core value. So when we lose a mother, when we lose a father, as I have in my life, a very painful loss of people who brought you into this world. In my conscious living, defined by my core values as unconditional love and compassion for others. What I have done and have tried to do in all of my life, in my personal life, with my family, with my community, in my professional life, in contributing in ways to help live up to the unconditional love and compassion for others. It is how I honor my parents, to embrace the value of what they gifted to me. And so core values, when you think about in this way, when we lose the people we love so much and the pain that comes with it, it is living up to another teaching of our elders. It's how we contribute and nurture the spirit that we lose physically when they return to the Creator, but their spirit continues to live in us. And as we become adults and we have children, it is what we then consciously think about gifting to our children. Or if you're a grandfather, as I am, to think consciously, what do I now gift to my grandchildren to be guided in their lives and in hopes that one day when I pass and return to the Creator and someone asks them, what core value defines who you are and what you do in your life and why you do what you do in your life, I hope that my children and my grandchildren will say, and this is emotional, that my grandpa gave me something that has guided my life. And if that is the answer to that question, if they were asked sometime in the future, that is a tremendous blessing that the life you have lived is going to live on through your children and your grandchildren and to the community that you are a part of.
That's so beautiful, Regis, and thank you for speaking on that and sharing that. That really hits close to home for me as well. I was very fortunate to have been raised and growing up with my grandmother, whom I just lost, I'd say, in the last year. She was a huge part of my life, and very much instilled values in me that I'm so fortunate to have. And I was a little kid. It reminds me of a story. And I was a little boy. I was always with my grandma, and I'd go to everything with her, and that's kind of what got me connected with with who I am and who my people are. And I had a conversation one time with a distant relative, but we're all very close knit here in our tribal communities. Um, and she was speaking to me, and I was actually with my grandmother and my great grandmother at the time. It was a very somber. It was a wake for somebody in our family, but they were speaking to me, and this lady, elder, spoke to me, and she said I was very blessed, and I didn't understand what she meant, but she said that you have, and I asked her what she meant, and she said that you have your great grandmother and your grandmother in your life, and she said that they always say that you know that you're rich, you're really rich when you have grandparents, um, and then she said, but you're also very wealthy. You're really rich when you have your great grandparents, very wealthy. And I didn't understand what that meant because you know, materialistically we didn't have a whole lot, but looking back and those values, that's exactly what I could feel from what you were speaking, and I just feel very fortunate to have had that. But now, you know, they've gone now. But some of those teachings that my grandmother did instill in me, and my great grandmother, was that compassion and empathy, and humility. You know, that's something that really, you never, don't ever be better than anybody. Don't ever think you're too good for anything, or don't ever speak down to somebody. You know, be on their level with them, understand where they're coming from, and that's something that, in a good way, and that's something that I always that harken back to when I'm ever finding myself in any type of position of leadership, or just engaging in my community. Not even so much even in leadership, but just engaging in the community. That's how I always, I can hear her and I can feel her still with me, and it's how I feel I can give back and contribute to what my grandmother and had given me, and taught me through her own experience, and her own her own I think of the term, the way she expressed it in her own way of living, model that it showed me how it's done and how to do it. And that's what I try to do. And it's challenging. You know, there are times where you lose sight of that. And I get fearful of that. You know, as she's, you know, in my life, in spiritual ways now, in my heart, but not in the physical sense. You know, I'm a little more distant now. And that kind of worries me, and fears for me. You know, I worry about that, losing sight of that, and losing our elders. Every day we lose an elder, whether it's, you know, in current issues happening with this horrendous pandemic, or just in life, we're losing them. And it's always a loss of wealth of knowledge. And so I guess with that in mind, it just makes me want to think of how do we authentically, how do we embrace those core values? You know, if you can maybe explain on that or speak to that, and how, you know, what are some ways for us to authentically embrace those values? You know, and I think you've already spoken to why those values are so important to building that future, indigenized future. But how can we, you know, for my own example, you know, having lost it in your own, you know, through what you were taught through your grandparents, how do we still keep connected with that, and just how do we get that daily reminder of staying true to those values instilled in us by our grandparents, and by extension our creator? How do we hang on to that?
You know, Cesar, I want to go back to something that you shared that is so critically important for us to realize, and that is, you know, the reference.
Oh, yours might be having a little some technical difficulties here with Regis. Let's see if we can get reconnected with him
Can
in
you
just
hear me
60
now?
seconds. Yep, I'm sorry. Yep, we can hear you now. We might have just had little difficulties.
What I wanted to say was I didn't want to lose a very important point you made, and that is the reference to the passing of a grandmother or grandfather or elders that are so beloved in our communities. And I just wanted all of us to think about a time in our families or in a larger context, in a community event or in ceremony. And there was a time in our lives that we could stand at one point and see in front of us all of the numbers of elders that were many in our lives. And now in similar events, if we can reflect where we are in our standing in our family or in our community or in ceremony, for all of us at this age, some older like me, we can look forward and see less elder people. As our elders say, less people with white hair, with gray hair, but you look behind you and there are many more following behind you than they are in front. It is really a recognition that as we talk about those passing on, our grandmothers and grandfathers, it is a realization that we must embrace, that we now are becoming the grandpas and the grandmothers of our families and our communities. And if the future is going to be as vibrant, despite all the challenges in our lives, the question that we have to ask is, what do we want future generations to inherit from us? How will children of the future reflect upon us in this time? And so when we ask ourselves another question, when is the time in our lives that we see the greatest expression of love and the greatest expression of respect and the greatest expression of compassion and the greatest expression of joy? Without much hesitation, most everyone is going to say, when we are in ceremony. And why is that the case? It is that because in that realm, we know the expressions of how to live and how to behave and how to relate that reflects love, and it reflects joy, and it reflects respect in how we treat one another in that realm. But think about this. Why is it, even as we recognized how beautiful it is that all of us can live to that kind of epitome, exemplifying all that is beautiful that we've inherited, that is reflected of the core values in that gives a spirit and vitality like no other for us to feel joyful and happy and at peace. But then comes Monday morning when we go back to work. Why is it that we act differently from that personal epitome of all that is beautiful as Indigenous peoples? But then we return into an environment, into a realm where there are many reflections of individuals and sometimes ourselves deviating from the core values that we defined in our lives that are supposed to guide us. I frame the answer to your question in that way to underscore what the elders teach, is that we cannot behave in our personal lives guided by our core values as the ultimate expression of how we honor those who gifted us with such loving ways that that core value guides our lives today. That cannot be separated from our professional lives to live by two inconsistent perspectives driven by perhaps two different incompatible values in how we make decisions. The elders teach us what I shared earlier, that if we are guided by our core values, we never make the wrong decision. They say that where we get into trouble in our decision making is when we make decisions that we know consciously is a deviation from these core values, and try to rationalize that the core value that we are jeopardizing to be a cost is somehow being rationalized and justified to be a benefit. And in our professional careers, that same measure and barometer of decision-making guided by our core values, in our Leadership Institute, we have tried to indigenize a return to decision-making guided by something as old as core values guiding those decisions, by asking ourselves, are the decisions we're making in our careers as program directors, as tribal leaders, as members of a tribal council, are the decisions we're making strengthening our core values, or are the decisions we're making taking us further away from the core values? So we develop something that has always been part of what academics and scholars define today as multidiscipline decision making. You know what that is in reality? It's an indigenous framework of decision making guided by core values. So that when you align your core values and you delineate on one side the benefits of being consistent with decision making to those core values, and in the other category, the cost of deviating from your core values in your decision making, when you assess the cost and the benefits in this analysis, that is purely in principle indigenous decision making guided by core values, you'll always make the right decision. Because as a conscious person, you don't jeopardize in principle making the right decision based on the consistency of adhering to the core values for the well-being of your community, for the well-being to the environment, to the well-being of the spirit of water and that sacred serpent, to all of the living things. That can be a cost if it's purely a decision based on something like economics in development, incompatible with core values. That's when we get in trouble. And that's what elders in their teaching talk about, the consistency when we deviate in decision-making from our defined core values. That's when we get in trouble, because that's when we start to move away in our decision-making guided by core values. And then the end result is that they become major cost to the well-being of people, the land, the environment, of the resources gifted to us, that we're gifted to sustain ourselves, to be healthy mentally, physically, spiritually, giving decisions to be driven by our defined core values.
Thank you for really contextualizing and sharing that. I think of what else. I mean, these are.
You know, one of the questions, Cesar, that to just have all of you think about in the work that you do that's central. And I can't say enough with the whole vision of being intentional in creating programs that provides all of us an opportunity to really reflect upon the past, to celebrate all of the generations that have gone before us, who have sacrificed much and have sometimes given up their lives to define our inheritance, and to put into context and perspective, to ask ourselves that earlier question, what do we want future generations to inherit from us? But here's another question that I think can help personalize the kind of important questions in our work. And here's one for all of us to think about. What do we love most about where we come from or where we call home? And then ask ourselves, what do we see or what threatens what we love most? And then ask ourselves a third question. What am I willing to do about diminishing the threat or the threats to what I love most? And it's another way to ask, what is the most desirable place where I want to raise my children and my grandchildren? And what stands in the way of achieving those aspirations of the kind of community I want, where I want to raise my children and grandchildren? And when we ask what stands in the way, to be able to ask ourselves, how do we get beyond what stands in the way? And when we answer these questions, it really becomes a defined agenda that I would say becomes actionable items in how we go about decision making, whether it's about designing programs, to ask ourselves, you know, one of the things that we have to be fully cognizant of in this time of self-determination and self-governance is, what are we doing differently in this time of self-determination, different from all of those times before when others were in control and we were critical of? Because in this time of unprecedented access to resources, a really important question to also ask is, are we simply replicating programs that we have been critical of because they contributed to, one, making our systems and institutions that have been part of our cultural survival fragile? And if we are, then we should really think hard that if we only replicate programs, that is a contribution in many ways that drives us further from our defined core values. And let me just use one classic example. When Head Start was introduced in the late 60s and early 70s, what we never asked, what we failed to ask is, where is Head Start a Head Start to? If not an earlier acquisition of English, and if that is the case, is that not an accelerated process for the youngest of our children into assimilation as a process using English as part of that design? And if that is the fact and the case, how different is that from 1890, when the first Indian education policy was introduced? And the mantra was, the way you kill language, the way you kill culture, is to remove the children from their language and culture and deny them their language and culture. That was the assimilationist policy introduced that created boarding schools. And if 100 years later, Head Start programs were created, and if we didn't rethink that language should be central to Head Start programs, generations innocently subjected to that help to contribute the acceleration and the paradigm shift to English. And then it became a painful recognition of how we contributed to our own demise, making language so fragile. But we responded in a way, and we rebounded in a way to make language central today in our education vision. So that same application, driven by core values, has got to be replicated in each of the realms that are important in health, in social services, in economic development, to use the same application of assessing the impacts of our decision making. And central in that question are the decisions we're making strengthening our core values, or the decisions we're making taking us further away from those core values, as a kind of fully cognizant engagement in our workplaces on behalf of the children, our families, and communities in terms of the decision makers as program directors or as policy makers. Because if we're not consistently driven by sustaining our core values, then we have to think that if we are making decisions that drive us further, then we have to think that at some point our contributions are contributing to our own demise.
Mhm. Yeah. Wow, I'm really glad that you shared that, and really in a very, very solid example that I hadn't even fathomed or tried to think of in that way. But that's going back to our values is so true. I mean, that's I guess one question building on that you already spoke about a little bit was with health, and I think it's just a very evident point, and we're seeing a very existential threat to our very existence as Native people, tribal communities especially. And we have tribal leaders who are probably listening in and watching this conversation and listening. Is what kind of advice would you might have for leaders who are currently working to strengthen their communities during this unprecedented pandemic? With this conversation in mind and these values, what type of advice would we want to share with them?
In this kind of larger context of health before COVID, it is very evident by all of the documented research findings at every level, from the executive, from Congress, from the states where we come from, to our own tribal assessments of the health disparities that exist as a result of a long history of impositions and inflictions that create the challenges we face today, to be recognized that they are deeply embedded in that history. So when we talk about health disparities, to provide context and the answer to the question with the impact of COVID, when we think about health disparities that existed before COVID, if in any one of our communities we identify 10 of the most challenging health issues, they're going to largely be common to all of our communities. They're going to deal with the way that history and food challenges and shifts results in obesity. It's going to point to how that impacts heart disease. It's going to impact diabetes and the impact of diabetes to liver disease, how the viciousness of what we've been subjected to over generations have created cycles of violence caused by dependence on substance, whether it's alcohol and drugs now, that results in that kind of deviation from maintenance and consistency to the core values in our lives, that results in the cycles of violence and ultimately the manifestation of the worst kind when we see such high rates of young people taking their lives because they are losing a sense of hopelessness. All of these health disparities, if you can imagine, for the most part, are self-inflicted. So what does that mean that they're self-inflicted? Well, there are ways that we have contributed, and sometimes not through our own fault, but what we have been subjected to over generations, that we can say that we can reduce with some commitment obesity, we can control diabetes, we can reduce heart disease, we can reduce substance abuse, we can reduce violence, we can reduce the impact that we have to young people who have a sense of hopelessness by being conscious, engaging our people and our communities to a contemporary visioning process to ask ourselves the kind of questions I posed, so that it becomes a collective conscious contribution to the kind of communities we want to be a part of, where we want to raise our children and grandchildren. Instead, when we are not able to do that, we become sidelined to be on the periphery, watching our communities become dysfunction. We can watch to see the violence destroy families, and in the end, entire communities where people don't want to live there anymore. And so all of this is intertwined and interrelated, but this is one of the greatest examples that the pandemic has exposed. And so it is compounding what was before COVID, but central beyond COVID as was the sharing and the vision of our elders. When I started off this discussion, I said that elders teach us of prophecies, but prophecies are central in our life journeys, not to accept the inevitability of what we see today to be the only truth of a conclusion in our life journey. Prophecies in their teachings are provided for us to be consciously aware of what we want to disrupt to prevent.
Yeah.
So when we say, when we're not conscious to be engaged to guide our lives by core values, elders say that we can contribute to move towards the cliff, a symbolic way to say, at some point, if we don't disrupt that process, we're going to fall over the cliff. That's what prophecies are meant to be, not to accept that ultimate prophetic conclusion and reality, but to be embracing prophecies as a teaching tool to disrupt what we don't want to see happen. So if language is so fragile, and language is one of the most precious gifts by our Creator, we can see the many examples of people coming to the aid to nurture the spirit, to not see the spirit of our languages die, with revitalization programs, with immersion programs. These are intentional ways to disrupt the prophecy that someday in our life journey, language will die. And they have died when we have not seen that as a visionary point in our life journey that we don't want to see, and therefore it compels us to disrupt it by being intentional in responding to the challenges in very defined ways so that we contribute to nurture, as fragile as it is, that it comes back to life, that it becomes strong, so that one of the things that we want most that future generations inherit from us is the gift of language. My grandfather used to always tell us that as long as there are seeds to plant, symbolically represented as you and Pearl shared, you are the seeds to your people. By keeping however way you can the spirit of the language gifted to you, to share it in the way that you did in the beginning of this discussion. That is the kind of intentionality that is part of conscious thinking, driven by the deepest love for our language and culture and our people and the way of life, all reflected in that circle of the gifts of the Creator, driven by the deep sense of love, driven by our core values, and reinforced by our adherence to the prayers and the faith and the ceremonial cycle purposely gifted to us to continuously to affirm, to reaffirm that prayer is a very significant part to keep alive core values, to keep alive that connection to the gifts of the Creator.
Thank you so much, Regis, for that. That intentionality is a big takeaway that I'm taking away from this conversation. And we have a few questions from people who are tuning into us this evening that kind of want to engage with you as well. One of those questions that I see here is, how does one support or nurture these core values outside of our Native communities. I think that's very important.
You know, in all of my work, 40 years at the state level and the executive, the former chief of staff to the House Speaker of the House of Representatives, all of the work that I've done on a national level, the same paradigm using core values is applicable in every area of work over my entire 40 years of public service. So I'm a very deep believer that what I'm talking about that is a gift to Indigenous peoples is really a common thread through the fabric of all of society. When you reflect upon the chaos and the violence we see every time we turn on the television today, think about this discussion and think about why masses of people are violently protesting, because central to that is the movement away from justice and equity to all peoples who are part of this, who are part of humanity. So the applicability of Indigenous thinking and gifts and core values in our discussion is also applicable to all of humanity. And when we engage using core values in those realms, use it and you'll find out that people from all walks of life, sooner than later in a discussion driven by core values, you're going to find out that we have more in common than not. And if we engage people in decision-making process using core values as an outcome, there'll be many times that you're going to reach your desirable outcomes than not as a result of the applicability of this discussion of Indigenous ways and core values that is also the common core of all of humanity, of Indigenous peoples around the world. That's the seed and the gift that we bring to this ecosystem of humanity, are these lessons. That's why our elders say, when we lose language and culture and we die, then we are removed from that human ecosystem. And like all threatened and endangered species, fish and wildlife and plants, the environment is diminished in its richness that you talked about, the wealth that we were given and blessed and inherited from our forefathers.
Wow. Well, Regis, thank you so much for sharing that and for kind of giving us all of these things to really think about with this evening. And we're just about getting to the point here at the top of the hour, but we definitely want to close in a very good, respectful way. But I think a few things to kind of that I'm kind of gleaning or from this conversation is this human ecosystem that you speak about. By embracing these values, it puts us in a different mindset individually, and then by extension in our community, by embracing these values, from going from just surviving through the day or through the moment into thriving and living. And I think that's something that's a takeaway that I'm getting from you, and just really thinking about that is changing that paradigm and getting out of just surviving and going more into living and thriving. And that can only be achieved when we embrace, identify, really sit back and then think about the things that we love most, that you spoke about, gifted to us by elders and the Creator, by ultimately. And what do we look at in ways of that are taking away things that we love, right? And what are we doing to stop that, right? Or to steer our community in a better position, thinking about those values. And those are some things that I kind of take away from it. I think you leave us a lot to leave with at this hour, thinking about those core values. But before we wrap up, I want to do things in a right way, in a respectful way, in a good way. If you could, before we close out, I think a few people from the NGC staff want to say a few things first at the end. But first, if you could maybe end us with a prayer to make sure that we all leave this sacred time that we had together in a good way. So if I could ask you to do that respectfully, sir.
I love that the way you summarized this discussion, Cesar. And I love especially to underscore what an incredible, beautiful gift we were given with all of these interrelated with the gifts of the Creator, the core values, a ceremonial cycle. I want to end with this. Our elders teach us that we will all become children again in this life cycle. And I want to share this at a very personal level, and it becomes emotional for me. But for all of you to consciously think about this, your children and your grandchildren and your community, what elders meant that we will all become children again in our life cycle. I saw personally when my mother and father could no longer clothe themselves. I was blessed to be able to do that. When they were no longer able to bathe themselves, I was blessed to do that. And when they were not able to feed themselves, I was blessed to do that for them. We have to ask ourselves, who will be our caretakers? Will that be loving and respectful and compassionate people? Who can answer that if not us at a personal level, as parents, as brothers and sisters, as sons and daughters, as husbands and wives, as grandpas and grandmothers? So I thank you for framing it in that way, because how beautiful is this, that we would not want to give this to our children and grandchildren, to our communities, to maintain that vitality and vibrancy. And so I'm not ashamed to share some tears, because my father also said to never be ashamed. That is how we gift to others what comes from the heart. And in this prayer of thanks for this discussion, I want to close with a prayer using our sacred cornmeal that Pueblo people use to pray, to say thanks for this discussion, to bless you, to open your minds and your hearts, that this discussion is the beginning of planting the seed, that if it makes sense to you, nurture it, gift it to others, be intentional in your decision making, and to ask yourselves, what can I do at a most personal level, Cesar, everyone on this call, when I get off this call and I go home, what can epitomize what I am going to plant? So with that, here's my prayer, and join me to give thanks in my native language. Tasish Sasha Usha Chanush Kutstil, Teom Kuhu Tioha Marstan. At the Hokashimi Mani Garstio on the Tuna you eat a church 8 new hours go money. Got show off the cheapest money at the hook amo at the Skanash Kaskawin Skaskea and Gusha with on you. At the Nashquish, the squish, it's a hair took a yahni couldn't no much couldn't. At the hair hot the new awik I shouldn't couldn't han as Hawana hot the get at there. Umushrach yahni kat showan truat marsh a trail with Tanya at the cottage cheat the kukashka. Then may you almost uni had the titiuta at the tuka yahni kutno cottage cheat the kukashka mars sahirani or had the charge to go on. With that, I want to share with you something in closing. If you all reach out with your hands like this, and you extend them out, and then bring your cusped hands to your mouth and embrace it. Inhale. So as I said, thanks to be blessed with Er's prayers answered to have this discussion from many miles away. That my prayer is for the Creator and our forefathers to open your minds and your hearts, to absorb and digest what we've shared, to plant those seeds and nurture those seeds as your gift to your children, your grandchildren, to your people. And that we follow the prescribed pathway of love and respect and compassion for one another. All this I ask, and as we share this symbolic embracing and we bring it to our mouths and we inhale, symbolically, that is how we share the spirit and the breath of those who've gone before us. We inhale to take within ourselves that spiritual gift, that we may follow in their footsteps by adhering to be driven by core values to guide us in our lives, and that all of you continue to be blessed. And I hope this is not the last time we are able to share time and to share values, but there'll be many more times. And I thank you for your conscious decisions to be part of this cohort, and to the many people at the Native Governance Center, blessings for your contributions to make this possible at a time we are challenged. But true to the prophecies of our elders, this is a time to reflect, to be introspective, to use life lessons learned to disrupt. That what COVID has exposed, we are capable with the gifts we inherited to disrupt what we don't want to see as the eventual reality of our demise. But beyond this, to survive with a conscious sense of living, that our communities will continue to be vibrant and they continue to thrive. And that is my prayer and hope for all of you as you continue your life journeys. And all of you are blessings to your families and your respective communities. So Cesar, it's been a pleasure to have this dialogue as you represent the rest of your fellows in this program.
Oh, well, Madzigiradz, Regis, and thank you so much. And I've always admired you and respect you, and just thank you. And it's a pleasure an honor to have this time spent with you. And it's a lot for me to think about this evening and moving forward. And I just really thank you. And so Madzigiradz. And with that, I think I'll leave it with Pearl with Native Governance Center to close things out. So Madzigiradz.
Thank you, Cesar.
Chimigwech, Regis, and Cesar. I've been kind of just tearing up hearing this discussion, because I think it's so important that we think about lives and our citizens and governance in this way. And I was deeply moved by thinking about that human ecosystem and how we contribute to that human ecosystem with our core values and the indigenous ways of knowing and being by practicing our original instructions. And when Cesar, you shared that your grandmother and the words that your relative shared about being rich because you have your grandmother and great grandmother within you, that really spoke to me, because my grandmother says the same thing to me. She said that when I was younger and continues to tell me that. And I now have a deeper understanding of truly what that means, understanding how connected we are to those before us, or those that came before us, and those who are yet to come, and my responsibility in that cycle as a mother and a family member, as a relative on this earth. And so Chimigwech for this discussion and for bringing our core values to the forefront. I have a lot more medicine in my heart because of this discussion. So Chimigwech. And if you all were moved and had tears as well, expressing that deepest form of love from this discussion, consider donating to our organization to continue supporting Indigenous superheroes that are real life Indigenous superheroes, and the work that we do to host events like this. Our website is nativegov.org. You can follow us on social media as well, and help us to reach some of our goals to make this work sustainable. And we'll be sending a survey out to those of you that joined us. On Facebook, we'll send it in the comments. And if you're on Zoom, we'll send it into the chat. And we really would like everyone to take this with you, take what you've learned today and pay it forward, share it with your family, your friends, and we wish you good health and wellness in this challenging time. So Chini Gwech, Weweni Sigo, and Giga Wabaman, we'll see you again.
There's gotta be some hope. There's gotta be some hope. There's gotta be some way for you to send your dogs away and to leave the land alone. It's gotta be a crime somewhere